And we have our second speaker, Barath Raghavan, and the title of his paper is Computational Agroecology, Sustainable Food Ecosystem Design. And really, I think all these authors conspire to write really interesting but really difficult to pronounce titles of papers for the session chair. So I have to kind of practice for this. So Barath, please.
All right. So I'd like to tell you about computational agroecology, which is what we see as a new field of sociotechnical system design to build new ecosystems and use computing to actually guide those ecosystems, the creation and the management of those ecosystems to produce sustainable food. And this is work with Bonnie, Sarah, Juliet, Bill, and Don from UC Irvine, University of Illinois, and Westmont. So I want to start with something pretty obvious, which is food is fundamental to our existence as humans. And everybody here ate today. And yet most of our food came from a farm that's like this. And this is radically different from the way that we've eaten as a human species for most of our existence. This field right here represents only one crop. It represents a scale of farming that really never existed until just the last 80 years. And this system, industrial agriculture, has a whole host of problems that are behind it. It's dependent on resources that are fossil-based, that produce ecosystem impacts that are felt in a wide range of contexts around the world. And simply put, it can't keep going. It's also a very inefficient system, as Michael Pollan makes clear here, that it takes 10 calories of fossil fuel energy now to produce a calorie of modern supermarket food. This is actually the opposite of what we want, right? We're taking energy from the sun, and yet somehow we're wasting that, and we have to put in a bunch of fossil fuel energy to actually produce the food energy that we consume as humans. Now, this is something that can't go on forever because we're talking about limited resources. And so the question is, how do we transform this system? Here's a depiction from NOAA showing the farms of the Midwest and the runoff from all of those farms going into the Gulf of Mexico. And this is creating an anoxic dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. There are many other places in the world where this is true, and it kills the life in the ocean and the rivers. And this is all actually wasted resources if you think about it. These are excess fertilizers and excess chemicals that are running off of these fields that are being applied because they're cheap at the moment due to various reasons temporarily. And so the question is, what do we do? How do we move on from this? Now, there's a field of science called agroecology. A scientific discipline uses ecological theory to study, design, manage, and evaluate agricultural systems that are productive and also resource conserving. Now, this science has been developed over the last 30, 40 years, but it has much deeper roots. It goes back to many different cultures, systems of sustainable agriculture that go back thousands of years. Not every region of the world has had techniques that are similar to agroecology, but I can give you a few examples of small-scale agroecology in practice. So here's a polyculture garden at a community garden in Urbana, Illinois. The participants of this garden have created multi-story polyculture being many plants being planted together to produce many crops. Here's an example at the food bank garden in Seattle, Washington, perennial herbs attracting pollinators. This isn't the primary purpose of the garden, but these pollinators and other beneficial insects are being attracted to the garden and providing extra benefits to the main crops that are being grown there. And more complex perennial polycultures, such as this one in Pahoa, Hawaii, where there's several hundred different fruit, nut, and vegetable crops being grown here, over 1,000 different cultivars. And they're all in a very complex arrangement, all being harvested from the same piece of land. Now, there are many other complementary techniques that are out there: organic farming, biodynamic, companion planting, permaculture, biointensive. Many of these have been developed independently. Agroecology, you could think of as drawing some of the best techniques from all of them. There's overlap between all of these different techniques. But as a scientific discipline, drawing together the best of all of these. But the main problem that they have and agroecology have is one of scale. Industrial agriculture has scaled the world over, has produced perhaps the most food per unit land with the least labor of any system that's ever been developed. And so it is clearly scaled. These systems have not scaled yet. Agroecology has not scaled yet. And this is really what we're trying to tackle in this work. And you can look at why these two systems have scaled or not scaled. You look at industrial agriculture, a system based on monoculture, on annual crops where you plant it, you plant the seed, you harvest at the end of the season, and you plant the seed again the next season. It's a uniform practice anywhere you go. You want to create a cornfield, you cut everything down, you plant the corn, you harvest the corn, and you repeat the process. And you put in inputs to keep that process going. An agroecological system depends often on a complex polyculture, many different plants interacting in complex ways, not just across space horizontally, but vertically as well and over time, because there are different successionary processes, ecological processes that take place. You're talking about a mix of annuals and perennials. Some will stay for a long time, some will not. They will grow, they will shade each other, they will have different interactions under the soil. These are site-specific as a result. You care about the topography of the land, how these are going to interact with the water flows, with the sun, with long-term climate change, and they're ecosystem-based. Rather than providing inputs of fossil fuel-based fertilizer, pesticide, and herbicide, we're talking about actually having ecosystem services. You want to have the animals and insects support the plants. You want to have beneficial insects eating the pests. You want to have fungi and mycorrhizal interactions underneath the soil. All of these things go into designing this complex ecosystem that is going to create a sustainable multi-crop yield. And so what we want to build is computational agroecology, a field really of systems to enable agroecology to actually scale. And these are different types of computational systems, so I'm going to briefly walk through them, and we talk more about them in the paper. So just to give you an example to think about what these might look like, this is a design from David Holmgren in Australia, who's a permaculture designer and one of the pioneers in that field. And just to give you an idea of something like agroecology, and this is a diagram of one of his sites. And these are some of the considerations that went into it. And these are the things that an expert is considering when building a site. But there aren't enough experts out there, and the knowledge that they need to keep in their head is overwhelming, so that there are very few people who can actually do this. If you just look at all of these things and you consider one thing, which is plant selection, on that farm, for example, that I showed you in Hawaii, you're talking about several hundred, maybe 1,000 different plants that are being chosen out of tens of thousands of possibilities. And you need to figure out how to lay them out, how to build the water flows so that you actually have water that's at the right level for every single plant that's in the ecosystem. Some may grow fast, some may be compost crops. So you need to figure out when you're going to be cutting those down and redistributing those, that organic matter back into the soil. All of these interactions are very difficult to figure out, even for an expert, and they often get it wrong. For a beginner, it's nearly impossible. And so the challenge for us is we have an expanded notion of what a farm is and what a farmer is, in our view. What we'd like to do is expand this notion out to the users of our systems are these new farmers on a wide array of different types of lands. Everything from a sidewalk strip and a backyard to a 100-acre or a 1,000-acre farm. The whole spectrum can allow for an agroecological design that is an ecosystem that's fully functional and that is producing food. And so these are the four classes of systems that we're thinking about: data, design, implementation, and maintenance. And so one of the big challenges here is that even identifying where this data is going to come from is difficult. All of those different properties that somebody needs to consider, that data is scattered out there. It's not consistent. It's not systematically collected. So just to give you an example, somebody like myself who's very interested in fruit trees knows nothing about fungi and mycorrhizal interactions. Somebody else might be very interested in how water flows across the land, but may not have much knowledge about insects and beneficial insect interactions. So all of these pieces of knowledge exist out there in practitioners and farmers, in the scientific literature. And what we need to do is build systems to crowdsource that. There are so many different types of knowledge too, even making them consistent in a way. There's sort of a meta level of crowdsourcing work to figure out how to integrate it so that we can build systems on top of it to actually do design. And that takes us to our next stage, which is actually doing a design of an agroecosystem. What we'd like is a user, somebody who wants to create one of these agroecological farms on any scale, to say, here's a site, I want to build something here, I want to actually grow some crops. And they specify some degree of constraints and also objectives. They want to grow these 5 crops and anything else that happens to grow well here. And these are the things that they can provide, these are the limitations that they have. And the system will then work with them in an interactive sort of guided co-creation of a farm on that site, an agroecological system. And the system will present a design possibly, or multiple designs, and the user will say, no, this isn't quite right. You know, I would like to have this instead of that. You know, I don't know how to get this plant, so we can't do that. There are all of these different aspects to the design process. So once the user is settled on a design, we need tools to actually implement this on the land. This is not as simple as you buy a tractor and you plow and then you plant seed. We're talking about so many different crops. They have to be planted in certain ways. You have to dig trenches in certain ways to make sure the water flows right. There are a lot of factors involved. For a beginner, this is very difficult. And so we want to have both systems that guide somebody when they're actually out there on the land, but maybe even robotics that help with this. There's a lot of different directions you can go when you're talking about implementing these designs. And finally, once you've actually laid it out on the land, you actually have to maintain it. You have to get both your harvest from this agroecosystem, and you also want to maintain it. You have to know that this tree over here needs to be pruned, and this crop over here needs to be replanted in the following way. And here too, there's opportunity for robotic help, but also just guidance on how to actually maintain this system over time. And there's a lot of sensing that needs to be done, but that's not primary. The primary task is really working with the users as they are on the land to figure out how to maintain their systems. So these 4 components, we hope will actually help create more agroecosystems and more interest in agroecology. And these are sort of the directions that we're working in. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions about this. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Barath? Yes?
Hi, fascinating talk. So are there some kinds of like basic primitives that you can use? I mean, there's a really large problem. There's tons and tons of possible combinations. Are there like, okay, these 5 crops work well together and therefore we can sort of build this out pretty easily as an overall system because this is, you know, obviously very ambitious.
Yeah, so there's a lot of work in specific climate zones of crops that work well together. And a lot of the work that's going on in agroecology actually is trying to sort of relearn a lot of the traditional knowledge that's been lost. So one of the big places that agroecology is being developed is in Central America, and they are trying to revive a lot of the tropical agricultural systems that are no longer being used, but were sustainable. And yes, they had complex crop interactions that worked well for them. One of the big challenges, and this is something that we're hoping we can actually mine, is what worked well in one place no longer works well in a lot of these places because the climate zones have shifted and are shifting actually fairly rapidly enough that this is causing a problem. And so extracting that traditional knowledge and then, you know, applying it to another place or projecting into the future and saying, this crop worked well here, but 50 years from now, it's not going to work. So we need to factor that in. So there's that kind of thing. One of the big challenges is also that complex polycultures, once you're trying to do a lab experiment that goes beyond 3 or 4 crops, it gets so hard to track the results that often in the literature they don't track the results. So most research papers will focus on these 3 crops we planted together and we got a greater yield than if we planted them separately. And then there'll be some other group of 3 or 4 crops. And so what we need to do is work on combining them, and then we're actually going to have to feed back the results from these systems back to the scientific literature, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of what I wonder about is, I mean, you're framing this as that the ecosystem has to be very complex, but maybe, you know, 10 crops at a time is sufficient. And you don't necessarily have to monitor at that scale to figure out exactly every little interaction because you already maybe already know what the potential interactions could be, and you could just...
Yeah, exactly. Actually, one of the things that we're hoping is that the quality of the models does not have to be great to get good designs. Because eventually, at its limit, we're talking about modeling all of nature, which is a little bit beyond what we think we can do. So hopefully we have to model just a small part of nature to be able to get a relatively sustainable ecosystem.
Thank you.
Hey, Barath, great talk. Super interesting. I was wondering about timescales, especially in the case, I think, of polyculture. Sometimes it can take a very long time to see what's working, you know. And I was wondering if you had any ideas about how that might be addressed. It's not your typical kind of scenario for A/B testing, so.
Yeah, so that is a big problem. And you're wondering particularly, how do you verify whether a design you've produced is going to work?
Is going to work, is working, yeah, whatever it might be.
Yeah, so one of the ways, one of the challenges in this work is, how do we even know whether our system is working or not in general? And so we came up with roughly 5 techniques that we're going to try to validate our systems. I mean, the ultimate test is always you have to build it and actually see what happens. One of the big ways is actually what we're kind of calling a agroecological Turing test, where you say, here's a design that was produced. We don't know if an expert produced this or whether the computer produced this. And then we're going to give that to a panel of experts, and they need to figure out whether this was produced by the computer or by some expert out there who knows what they're doing when they're building these farms. And what are the flaws in it? And then we sort of feed that back. So that's one way to test whether we've gotten it right, is really just use the human experts, the very few that are out there. Another is really that you have to build it out and compare it to industrial agriculture. Because at the end of the day, people are interested in how much food can I produce on this piece of land. And we are thinking of doing side-by-side tests.
Cool, awesome, thank you.
Hi, super interesting topic. I was wondering about the relationship between computational agroecology and traditional ways of knowing about agroecological systems. Because you mentioned that a lot of this, I mean, a lot of the work in agroecology is essentially reviving traditional systems of knowing and traditional ways of knowing about how to manage a farm. And how do you see that this complements? Because you say it's complicated to know all the interactions, yet traditionally systems have been there to actually know these things and actually create these combinations from start. So how do you see that this fits in with that and complements traditional ways?
That's a good question. The way I see it, and I'm sure there are agroecological experts who would disagree with this, but a lot of the traditional knowledge is site-specific, in the sense that I wouldn't say a specific farm, but a specific bioregion. And so the interactions of plants that happen to work well in that bioregion are what that traditional knowledge will contain. And so that knowledge may have been lost, and you can revive it and then create sustainable systems there. But for example, here in California, the agroecological knowledge, if we can revive it, I think it's very unlikely, you know, and many other places in the world. Those systems really haven't existed for ages. And in many parts of the world, especially in Europe through the Middle East, agriculture in the more monoculture sense has been around for a very long time, to the extent that there haven't been agroecological systems there for very, very, thousands of years. And so there are places where that traditional knowledge and the site-specific information just doesn't exist anymore. So we have to recreate it. And what worked a couple of thousand years ago, the last time that those systems existed, may not work anymore. The climate has changed, the region has changed, the soil has changed. So what we're hoping is that this can actually be scalable across different regions, that the same knowledge here in California will map to a mirror climate that's in Chile, in South Africa, in Western Australia. All of these places have similar climates, they have similar characteristics, and so you get a more global system that way.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.